It's the Real News. I'm Lynn Fries. My guest on today's show is Ethiopia's Alemayehu Geda, who's a professor of economics at the University of Addis Ababa. We're meeting at the United Nations Geneva, where Professor Geda just presented at an experts meeting. Welcome, Professor Geda.
Thank you very much.
The formal title of your presentation was The Elusive Quest for Structural Transformation and Job Creation in Africa. Will China make a difference? Start by commenting briefly on the underlying topic, that the reshaping of the global economy has major implications for Africa.
Historically, Africa has been trading and in terms of finance, engaging with today's developed countries, the Western economies, Europe, North America, and Japan. So these basically OECD countries. But in the last 15 years, the pattern of African trade and African finance is changing from this traditional partners to a new partners, China, India, Brazil, and to some extent also Russia. So this is a new emerging pattern, and it's very important for African countries to understand it and also to strategically think about it.
Here's a clip from some of your opening comments at the expert meeting as you provide some context on all this.
In the last decade, African growth has been very good, over 5% per annum for nearly a decade. And this growth is primarily driven by high commodity prices. And the demand for that comes from emerging economics in general, and China, India in particular. It has also significant implication for structural transformation in the continent. Starting 2003 up until 2013, for the first time, the terms of trade of Africa is getting better, reversed perhaps the 100 years deterioration of terms of trade by about 0.8% per annum, thanks to this commodity price. And in particular, the engagement of China in Africa became huge. Like, if you compare from mid-90s to 2016, the trade between China and Africa increased by about 66 times, from 3 billion to over 200 billion now. And in terms of finance also, Chinese finance is overtaking traditional financiers in Africa. This takes both foreign direct investment and also credit from Exim Bank of China. FDI is not that important compared to traditional financiers. Chinese FDI in Africa in terms of stock is not more than 4%. Still, the Western economies are the dominant in terms of stock of FDI. However, in terms of credit finance coming from the Exim Bank of China is becoming very important. It is estimated it could be about over 100 billion right now. And this is going invariably to infrastructure sector and the resource sector. And not only that, it is focused also in a few countries.
What are some of the main characteristics, as you see it, in this engagement between Africa and China?
There are three channels through which African countries are engaging with China. One is trade, basically. Trade in Africans in general sell primary commodities, unprocessed primary commodities, like oil, copper, and what have you, those kind of mineral resources. And the Chinese are selling manufactured goods. So basically one of the characteristics of this trade is the Chinese are selling manufactured processed commodities, manufactured goods, while the Africans are selling primary commodities. Second characteristic is there is significant inflow of capital from China to Africa. And traditionally with the industrialized countries of the West, it used to be foreign direct investment. Foreign direct investment means a company from Europe or North America comes to Africa, set up a company, and they control the management and do their business. But with China, it is different. Although they have foreign direct investment, it is not that important. Like from the total stock of foreign direct investment in Africa, which is over 557 billion, the share of China is just 17 billion, which is about 4%. But there is a different finance coming from China. We can call it quasi-FDI. It's not really foreign direct investment. It is quasi-FDI or credit financing, or sometimes they call it vendor financing, which means basically it is the African country who is doing the job or the investment, but the money for that comes from China, Exim Bank usually, but there are also other development banks from China, but the Exim Bank is the dominant one. And how different is from foreign direct investment? Well, the investments to begin with owned by African countries. Second, relative to traditional finance that we used to get from development partners, it is a little expensive. So I think that's which characterizes the finance and trade.
On the issue of how credit finance from the Exim Bank of China is becoming very important in Africa, what do you mean when you talk about bundling in the context of Chinese transnational corporations and the Export-Import Bank of China?
The Chinese government has a policy for its companies, multinational companies. As you know, Chinese have both private and public multinational companies. And their strategy was, what they call it going global. They have a strategy called going global. That means the government of China encourages its firms to go global, strategically engage with any country. And as part of that incentive, these companies can get money from the Chinese government to do their business. Now, therefore, when they came to a particular African country, they could be interested in trade. Say they can come to South Sudan or Sudan, and then they want trade on oil. Like, for instance, Sudan, before it's split into two, used to import 90% of its oil to China. Okay? So basically they came with trade. But that trade could be facilitated if there is finance for the firms that extract oil. Therefore, the Exim Bank of China will give them that finance that is required to do this trade. And sometimes, although it's not significant, that finance could have also some aid part. It's not significant. We did a study on Madagascar and Ethiopia, and the share of pure aid is just less than 1% in this country. So it's not significant, but there is aid in it. So there is credit finance in it, but primarily it's coming to support the Chinese multinational who are engaging, say, in the Sudanese oil sector. That's why I say that now trade, finance, and aid is bundled to have the strategic objective of going global from Chinese point of view. That's what when I'm referring to bundling.
In the case of Africa, what do you see as key challenges and opportunities that have been put into play on the back of China's strategic objectives of going global?
The coming of China to Africa is an opportunity in the sense that, you know, the Chinese were growing in the last 20 years by close to 10% per annum, and that creates a huge demand for resources, which Africa is capable of supplying. And as a result, you know, from 2002 until 2013, the global commodity price has increased, and primarily because of the Indian and Chinese demand for these commodities. And this is an opportunity because, you know, the terms of trade of Africa, African primary commodity price, if you compare it with manufactured goods that Africa is importing, it has been deteriorating for the last 100 years. It's only starting 2012 that it started to go up. And this is because of China, so this is a good opportunity. Second opportunity, the Chinese are building a lot of infrastructure in Africa, and Africa has huge infrastructural deficit, and this is an opportunity. The third opportunity is that the Chinese have a new policy called what is called rebalancing, which means they want to focus now their growth to be based domestically instead of the export orientation they have before or outward orientation they have before. Now they want to do it more domestic, depend on domestic investment, depend on domestic consumption growth. So this is what they call rebalancing. And also they want to go up on the manufacturing ladder to more skill intensive, technological intensive production of goods and services. As a result, there is a possibility that some of the low labor intensive goods producing firms might be relocated to other developing countries because wages in China is growing. Now the average wage in China is becoming about $500, $600. And if you happen to move to Ethiopia, for instance, the average wage that you pay is about $40. So this is a huge opportunity for Chinese. But for Africa, this is also a good opportunity because it is estimated about 85 million jobs. Firms that created about 85 million jobs in China are moving to developing countries, and Africa can have a part of that share. So these are the opportunities. Shall I go to the challenges?
Please do, yes.
Yeah, the challenge is that the Chinese, when they came to Africa, for that matter, when the Chinese goes to developed countries or developing countries, they have a strategy. They know what they want. But when it comes to Africa, we do not have a strategy on how to engage with them. Can we leverage this thing, for instance, for our benefit? Can we tell them to go to a particular sector in which we have a comparative advantage and in which we can create a lot of jobs? And as a result, we can reduce poverty? Not really. Why? Because we don't have the institutional and human capital to do that, to do research, to negotiate with them, to direct them, to follow them during implementation, to make sure that there is technological transfer during this process. So, to my knowledge, except probably in South Africa, we don't have that kind of systematic engagement with China. That is, I think, the danger, the challenges that Africans are facing like that.
What kind of strategic policy response do you think should be pursued by Africa in relation to China?
It should be multifaceted. To begin with, it shouldn't be locked to a particular country. It should be coordinated. I can think of two channels. One is the African Union, the Economic Commission for Africa. These are continental organizations. They were supposed to do research, engage African governments, to strategically think about engaging with emerging economies in general and China in particular, or for that matter, even with the West in general. So probably one channel I can think of, use the AAU, the African Union, the Economic Commission for Africa, to have a collective, a coordinated continental strategy. The second channel is, you see, the building block for African economic community that the AU envisaging is what we call regional economic communities. So the West African have the West African Economic Union. If you come to the East Africa, we have the East African Economic Community. If you go to Southern Africa, we have the SADC, or the Southern Africa Development Corporation. In North Africa, we have the Maghreb Union. So probably each of these RECs, regional economic communities, need to come up with a regional engagement strategy, and their individual countries need to pay homage to this agreed strategy when they design their own policies. Otherwise, if every country is competing for the resources and markets and opportunities are coming from China, it will definitely lead to the race to the bottom. And for that, probably my suggestion is, first have engagement strategy, do it in a coordinated manner. If you want to use the existing institution, one possibility is use the African Union and regional economic communities.
We should note that in Q&A at the expert meeting, the notion of kicking away the ladder that's been climbed to economic success, not only by the United States and every other developed country throughout history, but by China, was raised as an example of the kind of impediments to economic development facing African and other developing countries today.
Actually, you don't even have to go to history. You just can think of the Trump administration, which basically has this protectionist stance in its policy. So definitely, if you go to in the history books, we knew that when Europe developed, when the Americans developed their economy, they were protectionists. And famous American economist called Carey was against the import of commodities from British, and he was explicitly said that he was an advisor of one of the American presidents 150 years ago, and he said, if we don't protect the American economy, we end up being primary commodities forever for British interest. But see, once they pass that stage, they don't allow African countries to do it, because they want, the West wants the African countries to liberalize. Now come to China. I mean, for me, there is no fundamental difference between the East and the West. Every nation has its own interest. So it's not their fault, actually. The Chinese or the Americans or the Europe, it's not their fault. It is the African responsibilities, because we have to see this history that when these guys developed, they have interventionist governments, they have protectionist governments, they were planning everything. And I think Africans also need to do that. Now these days, we have to do it in a coordinated manner, because you cannot do it by yourself. So be it China or dealing with China or the East or the West, I think the market cannot deliver what you want. Free market cannot deliver you what you want. You have to guide the market. That basically means you have to have a government that strategically thinks. And to do that, you have to have, as I said earlier, the human and institutional capability to do that. If you don't do that, you end up repeating the relationship that Africa has with the West will be repeated with China for me.
Specifically drawing from Ethiopian history and the seminal thinkers among Ethiopia's economists, whose shoulders can you stand on today as a contemporary Ethiopian economist?
Historically, in 1920, there was this famous economist, it's my favorite, called Alemayehu Geda. 100 years ago, he did an empirical analysis of the relationship between Europe and Ethiopia. And he showed 100 years ago that the terms of trade of Ethiopia vis-a-vis Europe is deteriorating, because Ethiopia is selling primary commodities while importing manufactured goods. And he says, unless we industrialize by protecting our markets, we will end up poor for the foreseeable future. And it was prophetic. And 100 years down the line, we still didn't manage to realize his policy recommendations. And there were great economists in Ethiopia. We call them, actually, in the 30s, there were about 4 or 5 of them. We call them the Japanesers in Ethiopia. That period, 1920 to 1930, because they were advocating for a Japanese way of developing, which means basically take the knowledge, the skill from Europe and North America, from the West, but domesticate it to your own interest within your cultural setup. And they usually take Japan as their model. And in Ethiopian economic history, we call them the Japanesers.
Alemayehu Geda, thank you.
You're welcome. I enjoyed it.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.